In a small workshop in Washington state, just after World War II, a man stood over a machine that looked like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The fuselage gleamed like a light airplane, but parked beneath it were four wheels and a license plate. Folded behind the cockpit, wings waited to be attached like an afterthought. It wasn't a mock-up, it wasn't a sketch, it was real, functional, and road legal. The year was 1949, and the machine was called the Aerocar. Its creator, Moulton Taylor, wasn't chasing science fiction. He was an aeronautical engineer who had worked on aircraft design during the war. He understood lift, drag, and the hard math of flight. What he envisioned was simple in theory: a vehicle that could drive down ordinary highways, roll onto a small airstrip, attach its wings and tail, and take off within minutes. No cranes, no hangars, just one machine bridging two worlds. Today, when people search for early flying cars or lost patents in technological history, the Aerocar appears as a curious footnote, a black and white photograph, a short clip of a compact car transforming into a plane. It feels like a novelty from a more innocent era. But that image hides a deeper question. The Aerocar wasn't a fantasy. It flew successfully. It met federal aviation standards. It was certified by the Civil Aeronautics Administration in 1956. So why did the flying car never become part of everyday life? Taylor began developing the Aerocar in 1949, during a period when America was intoxicated with mobility. The interstate highway system was still on the horizon, but car ownership was exploding. Commercial aviation was expanding. Suburbs were spreading. The future, it seemed, belonged to machines that could move people farther and faster than ever before. In that environment, a roadable aircraft didn't feel absurd. It felt like the next logical step. The Aerocar's design was surprisingly practical. On the road, it functioned like a compact automobile, powered by a single engine that could drive the wheels or the propeller, depending on configuration. The wings and tail assembly could be towed behind the car in a small trailer when not in use. At an airfield, two people could attach the flight components in about 5 minutes. Once airborne, it cruised at around 100 miles per hour, comparable to small private planes of the era. This wasn't a sketch on paper. Taylor built working prototypes. The first Aerocar flew in 1949. Over the next several years, he refined the design. Only 6 were ever completed, but they were not fragile experiments. They were engineered machines, tested and flown repeatedly. Some records suggest that pilots even used them for cross-country trips, driving to local airstrips and continuing by air. In 1956, the Aerocar received official certification as an aircraft. That alone sets it apart from countless other experimental vehicles. It wasn't dismissed as unsafe. It wasn't banned. In fact, the government effectively said it met the standards required to share the skies. In the language of aviation regulation, that was a serious endorsement. And yet, there was a condition. Taylor needed firm orders before he could move into mass production. He estimated that about 500 buyers would be required to make manufacturing viable. For a moment, it seemed possible. Public demonstrations attracted attention. Newspapers covered the story. The idea of driving to work during the week and flying to a distant city on the weekend had undeniable appeal. The Aerocar appeared in discussions about disrupted innovation long before that phrase existed. But interest and commitment are not the same thing. The post-war optimism that fueled the dream also masked a set of quiet constraints. Private pilots were a small minority. Airfields weren't evenly distributed across the country. Flying required training, licensing, maintenance, and a tolerance for risk that most drivers didn't share. Owning a car was becoming normal. Owning an airplane was still an elite hobby. And there was something else. The Aerocar was, by necessity, a compromise. To make it light enough to fly, it couldn't be as solid or spacious as a standard automobile. To make it roadworthy, it couldn't have the performance of a dedicated aircraft. It lived between categories, and that in-between identity raised questions. Was it truly practical for daily use? Or was it a marvel that worked better in theory than in routine life? Despite certification and media attention, Taylor never secured the 500 deposits he needed. The production line never materialized. By the late 1950s, as jet travel began to redefine commercial aviation, and highways expanded across America, the window of opportunity narrowed. The flying car didn't disappear in a dramatic failure. It simply failed to scale. Still, the Aerocar didn't crash into obscurity overnight. It lingered, occasionally resurfacing in headlines and museum exhibits, often described as ahead of its time. That phrase sounds flattering, almost comforting. It suggests that the world just wasn't ready. But was that really the case? Or did the Aerocar reveal something deeper about how societies adopt technology, about the gap between engineering possibility and everyday practicality? Because the truth is, the Aerocar did take off. It flew. It drove. It was certified. And yet, the dream of personal flying cars faded back into the realm of prototypes and promises. To understand why, we have to look beyond the machine itself, and into the economic pressures, infrastructure realities, and cultural expectations of mid-century America. Forces that quietly shaped what the future was allowed to become. By the mid-1950s, the Aerocar had proven it could do what Moulton Taylor claimed. It could taxi down a runway, lift into the air, cruise steadily above farmland and highways, then land, shed its wings, and drive away like an ordinary car. The transformation was not theatrical. It was methodical. Bolts locked into place. Control surfaces connected. The propeller engaged. It was engineering, not magic. But engineering alone doesn't create a market. Taylor's central problem wasn't whether the Aerocar could fly. It was whether enough people were willing to live the lifestyle it required. In post-war America, aviation still carried a certain mystique. Private pilots were respected, sometimes even admired. But flying was technical. It demanded training, discipline, and regular practice. A driver could get a license as a teenager and operate a car with minimal oversight. A pilot had to log hours, maintain currency, and comply with federal regulations. The psychological barrier between driving and flying was enormous. The Aerocar quietly forced its owner to belong to two worlds at once. You needed a driver's license and a pilot's license. You needed access to both roads and runways. You needed mechanical awareness beyond that of the average commuter. For some, that dual identity was thrilling. For most, it was a complication. There were also financial realities. Even if the Aerocar had entered production, it wouldn't have been cheap. Aviation-grade materials, lightweight structural components, and certification processes added cost. Taylor estimated he could make production viable with 500 confirmed orders, but that number wasn't arbitrary. It reflected the scale required to reduce unit cost to something approaching affordability. He never reached it. Reports from the period suggest that Taylor came close to securing a manufacturing deal. But negotiations fell apart when the deposit threshold wasn't met. Without those firm commitments, investors hesitated. From their perspective, the risk wasn't technical failure. It was limited demand. A flying car sounded revolutionary, but revolutions require buyers. Infrastructure posed another quiet obstacle. In 1949, the United States had thousands of small airfields, many built during World War II. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that general aviation would become as common as car travel. Yet even at its peak, those airfields were not embedded into daily urban life. They were often on the outskirts of towns. Suburban expansion prioritized roads, not runways. The coming interstate highway system would further entrench ground travel as the dominant mode. The Aerocar relied on a hybrid ecosystem that never fully formed. It needed a culture in which people saw small airports the way they saw gas stations, ordinary and accessible. Instead, aviation remained specialized. Most Americans experienced it through commercial airlines, not personal aircraft. And then there was the issue of compromise. In the air, the Aerocar performed respectably, but it wasn't a high-speed, long-range aircraft. On the road, it functioned capably, but it wasn't as comfortable or powerful as contemporary cars. Its design was shaped by weight limits and aerodynamic constraints. Every pound added for road comfort made flight more demanding. Every structural reinforcement for aviation standards affected driving performance. This balancing act is the hidden tension in many early technological experiments. To bridge two systems, a machine often becomes less than perfect at either one. The Aerocar wasn't flawed in a catastrophic sense. It simply lived in the gray space between optimized categories. Cultural perception played a role as well. In the 1950s, American identity became deeply tied to the automobile. Highways symbolized freedom. Drive-in theaters, roadside diners, suburban garages, these weren't just conveniences, they were rituals. Cars were personal spaces, decorated and modified. Planes, by contrast, were tools. They required checklists and pre-flight inspections. They demanded discipline. Owning an Aerocar meant redefining what everyday mobility looked like. It asked its owner to treat travel as a technical operation rather than a casual routine. That shift may have been too abrupt. Some observers have suggested that safety concerns also lingered beneath the surface. Even if the Aerocar met federal standards, the idea of ordinary drivers lifting into shared airspace raised questions. Air traffic control systems were not designed for thousands of daily commuters. Weather added unpredictability. A stalled engine on the highway is an inconvenience. In the sky, it's something else entirely. None of these factors alone doomed the Aerocar. But together, they created friction. And friction is often enough to stall adoption. By the late 1950s, America's technological imagination pivoted. The space race began to capture attention. Commercial jetliners shrank continents. The narrative of progress moved upward and outward toward orbit and supersonic speed. The modest dream of a personal flying car began to feel less urgent, almost quaint. Taylor continued refining his designs for years. Variants were proposed. Improvements were sketched. The core idea refused to disappear from his mind. Yet large-scale production never materialized. The Aerocar became an object of fascination at air shows and in magazines, a reminder of a future that almost arrived but never quite settled into place. What makes this story complicated is that there was no dramatic collapse, no explosion, no government ban. The Aerocar passed its tests. It functioned as designed. It simply couldn't gather enough momentum to reshape daily life. And that raises a more uncomfortable question. If a working flying car existed as early as 1949, certified and roadworthy by 1956, then the barrier wasn't physics. It wasn't a lack of imagination. It was something more structural, something woven into economics, infrastructure, and human behavior. To see it clearly, we have to examine not just what the Aerocar could do, but what kind of society it required in order to thrive, and whether that society ever truly existed. By the time the 1960s arrived, the Aerocar had drifted into a strange category. It wasn't a failure in the dramatic sense. It hadn't crashed and burned. It hadn't been outlawed. It simply existed, functional, certified, admired in photographs, while the world quietly moved in a different direction. To understand why, it helps to look at the larger economic machinery shaping mid-century America. Mass production was the defining force of the era. Companies like Ford and General Motors weren't just building cars. They were refining assembly lines to push out millions of nearly identical vehicles at prices the middle class could manage. Profit depended on scale. Standardization reduced cost. Specialization improved efficiency. The Aerocar, by contrast, resisted that logic. It required aerospace-grade craftsmanship combined with automotive manufacturing. It didn't fit neatly into either industry's existing infrastructure. An automobile factory wasn't set up to produce detachable wings and flight control systems. An aircraft manufacturer wasn't structured to think about highway regulations, bumpers, and parking spaces. To build the Aerocar at scale would have required collaboration across industries that rarely overlapped in practical terms. That kind of coordination was possible, but only if the demand justified the investment. Demand never reached that tipping point. There's also a subtler reality. Technologies don't just compete on capability. They compete on convenience. A traditional car required almost no specialized preparation beyond fuel and occasional maintenance. A small airplane required hangar space, regular inspections, weather awareness, and scheduled servicing under federal aviation rules. The Aerocar inherited the obligations of aviation even when it was sitting in a driveway. Insurance presented another layer. Covering a hybrid vehicle that could operate in two regulatory environments wasn't straightforward. Liability in the air differed from liability on the road. Even if policies could be written, premiums would reflect the uncertainty. For an average family considering weekend travel options, that uncertainty translated into hesitation. Meanwhile, commercial aviation was becoming more accessible. Instead of owning a small plane, Americans could book seats on increasingly reliable airlines. Instead of flying themselves across states, they could purchase tickets at steadily improving airports. The convenience of simply being a passenger began to outweigh the romantic appeal of piloting one's own craft. The Aerocar belonged to a philosophy of personal control, of being both driver and aviator, but the broader trajectory of transportation was leaning toward professionalization. Trained airline crews, managed airspace, large, efficient aircraft carrying dozens, then hundreds of passengers. The individual flying car started to look less like the future and more like a parallel path that never aligned with the main road. There's a tendency, decades later, to say the Aerocar was ahead of its time. That might be partly true. Modern materials, lighter engines, and digital navigation systems could certainly make a roadable aircraft more practical today than in 1949, but it's also possible that the timing wasn't the core issue. Society didn't just lack technology. It lacked the appetite to restructure daily life around personal flight. Road networks were predictable. You could leave your house and reach your destination using paved systems that expanded every year. Air travel required planning around weather and designated landing zones. Even if small airports were available, they weren't integrated into neighborhoods the way roads were. A flying car didn't eliminate infrastructure constraints. It merely shifted them. And then there was human behavior. Driving became routine precisely because it felt manageable. The average person could operate a car with confidence. Flying, even in calm conditions, demands constant situational awareness. Altitude, wind, navigation, air traffic. These aren't passive variables. They require active interpretation. The Aerocar asked ordinary citizens to adopt that mental framework as part of everyday mobility. Some enthusiasts embraced that responsibility. Most did not. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, fuel crises and economic shifts further cooled experimental optimism. The Aerocar prototypes survived, occasionally restored or displayed, but they no longer represented an imminent transition. They became historical artifacts, proof that the idea had once been tangible. And yet, the concept of the flying car never truly disappeared. It resurfaced in science fiction films, concept sketches, and later in startup proposals promising electric vertical takeoff vehicles. Each new wave framed the dream as if it had never quite been tried before. But the Aerocar stands as quiet evidence that it was tried, carefully, seriously, and with regulatory approval. So the real mystery isn't whether a flying car can be built. That question was answered in 1949. The deeper question is why technological possibility doesn't automatically translate into social adoption. Why a machine can function exactly as intended and still fail to embed itself into everyday life. Because when we look at the Aerocar, we're not just looking at a hybrid vehicle. We're looking at a crossroads moment in transportation history, when personal aviation could have merged with car culture, but instead remained a side story. And to fully understand that turning point, we have to return to the workshop where Moulton Taylor first shaped aluminum and steel into a compromise between sky and pavement, and ask what he might have seen that the market didn't. In the end, the Aerocar didn't vanish in a warehouse fire or collapse under scandal. It faded the way many ambitious machines do, quietly, gradually, almost politely. A few prototypes survived. One eventually found its way into museum collections. Another appeared at auctions decades later, treated less as a transportation breakthrough and more as a rare collectible. The object endured. The movement behind it did not. If you look closely at photographs of the Aerocar today, one detail stands out. The wings, when detached, sit on a small wheeled frame like a reminder of an alternate identity. Parked in car form, the vehicle seems incomplete, as if part of it is waiting just out of frame. That visual tension captures the entire story. It was always in between states. Moulton Taylor didn't abandon the idea because it failed technically. He stepped back because the environment around it never aligned. Investors wanted scale. Regulators required compliance in two domains. Consumers wanted simplicity. The Aerocar offered freedom, but it demanded responsibility. It promised flexibility, but it introduced complexity. The dream of flying cars has always been framed as a matter of engineering. Lighter materials, more powerful engines, better control systems. In reality, the Aerocar suggests the challenge runs deeper. Transportation systems are ecosystems. Roads connect to zoning laws, insurance markets, fuel distribution, and cultural habits. Air travel connects to air traffic control, weather forecasting, licensing, and international regulation. To merge them isn't just a design problem, it's a social one. In 1956, when the Aerocar received its aircraft certification, it symbolized something rare, official acknowledgement that the hybrid concept was viable. The Civil Aeronautics Administration didn't dismiss it as fantasy. They treated it as a legitimate aircraft. That milestone should have been a launch pad. Instead, it became a historical marker, a point in time when possibility was proven, but momentum stalled. Some historians argue that if Taylor had secured those 500 orders, the narrative might have shifted. A small production run could have created visibility. Visibility might have drawn more buyers. It's possible. But even if a few hundred Aerocars had entered driveways, they would still have faced the same structural headwinds: limited airfields, expensive maintenance, dual licensing, weather constraints, cultural inertia, and cultural inertia is powerful. The 1950s future that Americans embraced was grounded, suburban, and highway-bound. The garage became a domestic fixture. The road trip became a rite of passage. Commercial airlines absorbed the sky, turning flight into something scheduled and standardized. There wasn't much room left for a personal aircraft that required hands-on piloting. What makes the Aerocar's story linger is that it disrupts a comforting myth. We often assume flying cars don't exist because they're impossible. The Aerocar proves they were possible, at least on a small scale. They just didn't align with how people actually wanted to live. Decades later, new companies would revisit the concept with electric propulsion, vertical takeoff designs, and automated navigation. Each time, the pitch sounds familiar: congestion relief, point-to-point travel, a three-dimensional solution to crowded roads. Yet the same questions surface beneath the marketing. Where will they land? Who will maintain them? How will airspace be managed at scale? And will everyday commuters embrace the responsibility? The Aerocar suggests that the answer isn't only about technology maturing. It's about society deciding whether the trade-offs are worth it. Moulton Taylor reportedly remained proud of his creation. By most engineering standards, he had succeeded. He built a working roadable aircraft. He flew it. He certified it. He demonstrated that the boundary between car and plane wasn't fixed by physics. It was flexible, if someone was willing to engineer around it. But flexibility doesn't guarantee adoption. Today, when one of the surviving Aerocars is displayed in a museum, it sits under soft lights. Visitors walk past, pausing long enough to register the novelty. Some smile at the retro-futuristic lines. Others read the placard and nod at the phrase "ahead of its time." What the machine really represents is something quieter. A moment when a single engineer asked whether mobility had to stay in its lane. A moment when the sky and the highway briefly shared a blueprint. The Aerocar did take off. It lifted into the air and proved its point. What never truly took off was the surrounding world required to sustain it. And so it remains, half car, half airplane, and entirely a reminder that sometimes the future doesn't fail. It simply chooses a different direction.